Yes, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, for the second part of our symposium today. The second part is dedicated to the issue of maritime security in the Indo-Pacific, and more specifically, the safe passage and the safe transport of raw materials, as well as finished goods, over the waterways, the sea lines of communication. Now, I think as we're all aware of, we live in a time of intense and intensifying great power competition, in which, historically speaking, great power competition has led to contestation of the sea lines of communication. However, what is different from the past, I would submit, is the fact that small and especially middle powers play a more important role in international affairs. They are of a different nature in demographic terms. They are of a different nature in economic terms. They are, we could argue, and we will debate that today, also of a different nature in military terms. And that could very well mean that they have a greater political impact in the regulation of international affairs. Now, as such, they play a key role in cooperation and in competition. So today we are going to look at the question, what can small and middle powers do in the context of that increasing Sino-American competition in the region to ensure and uphold maritime security. And in doing so, we are very pleased that we're joined today by a very eminent panel of speakers who are going to kick off each with a presentation, following which we will have a Q&A. I will start with a number of questions, not abusing, but using my prerogative as a moderator, but then surely we'll open up the floor to the audience gathered here today. And we will do so for those that haven't joined, that weren't there for the first part, making use of all the attributes that Zoom offers us. So there's a Q&A or a chat function at the bottom of your screen, and please feel free to use it and post your questions there. We will make sure to pick up on those questions and we'll put them to the panelists. With that, I would like to introduce our esteemed panelists today. I would like to start off with introducing Mr. Masafumi Iida. Welcome, Mr. Masafumi. Mr. Masafumi is the head of the America, Europe, and Russia division. I'm reading this, as you can see, of the Regional Studies Department at the National Institute for Defense Studies. He has a long publication track record and a background in both policy management, media and governance a long time ago, but also a specialization from Stanford University later on in East Asian studies. And I would recommend you or us all to take a look at this impressive and interesting publication record. Then, following Mr. Masafumi, Ms. Celine Pajon, I hope I pronounced that well. Yes, I see a thumbs up, is joining us. Mrs. Celine is the research fellow head of Japan Research. She's an international research fellow with the Canon Institute for Global Studies in Tokyo and was a visiting fellow with the Japan Institute for International Affairs, Tokyo, back in 2016. You are now with IFRI, Celine, I may add, and your area of expertise is Japan's foreign and defense policy, as well as geostrategic dynamics of the Indo-Pacific area. And then last but not least, my colleague, Paul van Hooft at HCSS. Paul is a senior strategic analyst at HCSS, and he's our chair of the HCSS Europe in the Indo-Pacific Hub. His work focuses on Indo-Pacific security, transatlantic relations, the origins and logic of American grand strategy, European grand strategy and security, nuclear strategy, alliances, and extended deterrence. And Paul and I have done quite some work over the past few years on not just issues of deterrence, but also issues of international and regional order, specifically pertaining to the Indo-Pacific. I forgot one important thing, which is to introduce myself. My name is Tim Swijs. I'm the Director of Research at HCSS, and I will be your moderator today. With that, let's get started. We're going to start off with you, Mr. Masafumi. The floor is yours. You have 15 minutes, and I understand you're going to make use of a PowerPoint, so please feel free to upload it. I'll give you a sign 2 minutes before the end of your presentation. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much, team, for your kind introduction to me. And I would like to express my sincere thanks to the Hague Center for Strategic Studies for giving me this great opportunity to share my views on the Chinese maritime strategies with you. So I'm very happy to hear, because I believe that now is the very important time, and now is the time for the Japan and the European countries to deepen our cooperations to countering the Chinese intention and the powers to changing the status quo or in the Indo-Pacific region. Anyway, let me share my slides. And today, I'd like to talk about the Chinese maritime strategy and its negative impacts to the status quo or in the Pacific region, and also how we can cope with the challenges posed by China in the Pacific waters. First of all, I think that China has at least two important objectives in its maritime strategy. The first one is to solve the sovereign and also the territorial disputes in China's favor through its coercion, including the possible use of force if necessary. The second important strategic goal for China is the protecting the Chinese maritime rights and overseas interests. I think it includes, first of all, the safety of the sea lines of communication for China, and also the protecting the resource interests all over the world, actually, and also the protecting the Chinese infrastructure projects in the Indo-Pacific region, and also the Chinese companies and the Chinese workers in this region. But you know that I think that to achieve these two important strategic goals, it is important for China, China has to overwhelm the dominant US military presence in its peripheral water and also its beyond. Why the United States is a military ally of Japan and the Philippines, and also the security partner of the Southeast Asian nations. And also now the United States is accelerating its support of Taiwan's defense. So if China would like to achieve the first objectives, solving the sovereignty and territorial disputes, China has to kicking off the US military presence in this region. And also the United States is a founder and also the protector of the free and open maritime water, which we share since after the World War II. And also the United States is clearly opposed to the changing the status quo by force, which China would like to achieve. And also the United States is maintaining a very strong military presence along with the Chinese sea lines of communications. So China really worried about the possible military pressure from United States, US naval forces against vis-a-vis the Chinese sea lines of communications. So in other words, I think that when China militarily dominates the waters in the Indo-Pacific, the Chinese objectives will be achieved. Under this circumstance, the hurdle for solving the sovereignty disputes by military force by China will decrease. And also China can put more regional countries under its influence by threatening their sea lines of communications in the Pacific. For example, if the China dominates in the Pacific region, in the Pacific waters, the China can use its naval force to put pressures on the sea lines of communications over the Japan, not only Japan, and also the Southeast Asian nations, and also the India, and probably the other countries, the European countries, which take the opposite stance against the Chinese maritime interests. So, and also if the China dominates the waters in East Asian region, the China can make leverage of this predominant position in East Asian waters to expand their military operations beyond the East Asian waters toward probably the Indian Oceans and also the waters around the European countries. So that's under these circumstances, I think the situation is much easier for China to conduct some kind of expeditionary operations, not only in East Asia, but also in Central Asia, Middle East, and Africa, for protecting the Chinese overseas interests, like the Chinese factories and the Chinese workers. And I think if these situations happens, we gonna see the very bad future, which means the spread of authoritarian and also the exclusive international order led by China and its followers. You know that actually, indeed, the China is greatly expanding their military activities in East Asian waters. For example, in August last year, the China conducted a very large-scale military exercise around Taiwan for giving pressure on Taiwan, and also around Japan. The China, in tandem with the Russia, is expanding their maritime and also the air military exercise activities around Japan. So it is very clear that China has intentions, and also China is increasing their muscles to achieve their objectives to dominate the waters in East Asia. And not only in East Asia, China also is steadily expanding their military operations and military presence into the India side of the Indo-Pacific region. So we already see some footprints of China in this region, like the Ream base in Cambodia, and also the Chittagong in Bangladesh, and the Hambantota in Sri Lanka, and the Djibouti, and also the Port Sudan, and so on. So I think that the Chinese ascendancy, maritime ascendancy in East Asia will inevitably invite the more presence and the more military operation by China in Indo-Pacific region, and which inevitably affect the maritime interests of East European countries. So that's why I think it is very important for the status quo powers, including Japan, United States, and also the European countries, to understand the global nature of China challenges. I mean, if the China's maritime ascendancy in East Asia will cause first the infringement of the sovereignty of the regional countries, which is contrary to the existing rules-based international order, and also it will invite the regional instability, including the military conflicts on Taiwan, Senkaku Islands, and Spratly Islands. We cannot deny the possibility, and also the retreat of the U.S. maritime presence in the Pacific is caused by the Chinese ascendancy in East Asia. And finally, we're going to see the fatal damage to values and rules in the existing international order, challenged by the revisionist coalitions headed by the China, in tandem with maybe the Russia and maybe the Pakistan, Iran, and North Korea. So I think that it is our very important interest to counter these Chinese objectives and prevent these Chinese objectives from being achieved. To do this, I think that the combined efforts to prevent China's maritime dominance is really needed by status quo nations. Even though middle powers, but the Japan and the European countries can play a very, very important role in achieving this goal. For example, I think that we have to, I mean, the Japan and the European countries have to support the U.S. maritime superiority in the Pacific region. For example, we can much deepen our interoperabilities with the United States. And also we can do, we can provide more logistical support for the United States in the Pacific region. For example, we can provide the more bases or more protection on the U.S. maritime and air assets in this region. And secondly, I think we have to enhance our military presence by the status quo powers in East Asia. Of course, the Japan is making every effort to enhancing our defense capabilities in this region to counter Chinese intentions to change the status quo. But I think it is also the very important interest for the European countries to increase their military presence in this region to push to put the pressure on China for not taking the aggressive actions in this region. To achieve this goal, I think the combined patrols and exercises between the, for example, the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Forces and the European navies is the good way to enhance our presence in this region. And also, I think the longer mutual deployment of ships is another good way. Last year, some of the European navies dispatched their ships to this region, and they conducted the joint combined exercise with the self-defense forces. I think this is really good, and this is really important ways for us to maintain the status quo in this region. I understand that now the European countries is facing with a very serious military threat from Russia, and I think I understand it is very important for the European navies to defend itself in Europe from the threat from the Russia. So I think, and I believe that even though the self-defense forces, maritime self-defense forces is very stretched in their operations vis-a-vis China, but it is still very important for the Japanese navies to send its ships to the European waters and show its strong will and the capabilities to counter the Russian intentions to change the status quo by coercion and by force in Europe. So anyway, I think this type of the coordination and the cooperation between Japan and the EU European countries in maintaining the status quo in the Pacific, which are seriously challenged by Russia and China. And finally, I think that it is also very important to counter the Chinese influence over the littoral states in the Pacific, because the China is trying to expand their not only the economic influence, but also the political, diplomatic, and also the defense influence in especially in the developing countries in the Pacific region. And the Chinese source of influence is the economic assistance toward these developing countries. So that's why I think it is also the good way for Japan and the European countries to provide more economic assistance to the developing countries in this region for balancing or the reducing the Chinese growing economic influence in this region, which is going to be very helpful for us to invite more regional, medium and small countries to supporting our stance to maintain the status quo and countering the China's and Russian intention to change the status quo by a coercion in this region. I'll stop here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for a very enlightening talk in which you touch on many relevant issues. Before we're gonna move over to Celine, I am gonna ask you a question, Mr. Masafumi Iida. I mean, and I'm talking from a European perspective here. There's many European countries really that are still on the fence and that question whether joining the US in what you could argue is an anti-China coalition, whether that is the wisest course of action. Some even argue that it contributes to polarization instead of dampening it. Well, given your expose, given your analysis, and I think it's a fair analysis, I may add, of China's revisionist policies, it's not just strategy, actual policies, there's action in place. In your view, is teaming up with the US the only way forward, or are there other ways in which middle powers can contribute to the upholding of specifically maritime security and maritime order? Putting you on the spot here, but very keen to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think that of course the U.S. Is a really strong power to counter the Chinese intention and the Chinese growing military might in this region. But you know that we cannot only rely on the United States, because the maintaining the maritime safety cannot be achieved by the United States. For example, the sea lines of communication is very, very long. For example, the sea lines of communications for Japan is starting from the South China, East China Sea, South China Sea, the Malacca Strait, Indian Ocean, and then the Mediterranean Oceans. So even though the United States cannot by itself maintain the old line of the sea lines of the communication. So it's really important to invite or encourage the littoral states, including, of course, including the medium and the small countries, to support the existing rules-based maritime order to keep the safety of the sea lines of communications, which is clearly challenged by China. And so that's why I would say that we should cooperate not only with the United States, but also with the other like-minded countries, including the middle sized or small sized. So that's my opinion.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Let's continue then. On to you, Celine. Very keen to hear your views. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tim, for the kind introduction. Thank you, the team of the Hague Center for Strategic Studies, for having me for this discussion today. I will inevitably repeat some of the elements that the Professor Iida talked about, because obviously China is a big important factor in the region that is challenging the freedom of navigation and the open sea lines. But I think not only China is to blame. There are also other kind of threats. So what I will do is very quickly highlighting the main challenges, the main threats in the region, and then look at what we are doing, what we can do together to address their threats. And before doing that, I would just like to recall some numbers, because obviously there's Indo-Pacific sea lines of communication are crucial, not only for the Asian country, but also for European countries as well. So the Indo-Pacific is the second largest destination for the EU exports, and home to 4 out of the EU's 10 top trade partners. We know that more than 60% of maritime trade passes through the ocean in the region, and especially 1/3 of the global trade going through the South China Sea, and we know how tense is the situation on this part of the world. So obviously, this is very, very important for both of us. What are the main threats? Yeah, I will highlight both, I would say, traditional kind of maritime security issue, maritime expansions, territorial dispute, but also non-traditional security issues such as crimes at sea. And we know that all this it's very difficult to tackle. Recently, we hosted in IFRI the first naval conference of Paris, and we had very good discussion with the chief commander, who recalled that the ocean is really a hybrid theater. It's a fluid environment. It's a remote theater. The frontiers are not so so to say, solid as on the land. And so it's very difficult first to know what happens at sea. What we see also as a key trend recently is both an increasing challenge to the rule of law at sea. We see more and more states just using, reinterpreting the law of the sea to use it for their own interest. And also what we see more recently maybe is the return to the risk of a high intensity conflict and to combat at sea. And this was also other kind of issue. And so we'll start with this scenario, the high intensity conflict. And why we see that, it's quite obvious. We see the naval buildup in the region, in the all Indo-Pacific region, triggered by China. We say in France that China is building the equivalent of the French Navy every 4 years. So the path is really very, very quick. We see also anti-ships missiles being deployed in many countries in the region in order to protect the shores. We see trends of catch-up and also modernization of naval capacities. So it means that there are more ships at sea, so more cases also of unexpected incidents that can escalate. And I think we see also a kind of stability dilemma, so to say, because we see China on its way to achieving nuclear parity with the US by the end of the decade, experts think. And so China might take advantage of this position to multiply naval incursion and to continue to push its expansions in the East and South China Sea. In addition, China will obviously remain the dominant military power in the region, if I accept the US. And the asymmetry in military capabilities will remain one of the key features of the regional security environment. As we see more investment in naval capabilities by also Chinese neighbor, we see more capable countries that will and capabilities that will complicate China's calculation, but also raise again the likelihood of any incident at sea that could degenerate. Especially, of course, the Taiwan Strait is a hotspot. We saw the recent naval and IFRI movement by the PLA eventually pointing to a possible blockade of the strait, which will have would have catastrophic consequences for the region, but also would disrupt very important maritime routes and global value chains regarding semiconductor, especially as Taiwan is holding a very specific and a crucial role in the semiconductor industry. So Taiwan Strait is obviously a top priority that has to continue to be monitored in the coming years. But I think other part of the world will also be we'll see more risk emerging, and I may point to two regions. One is the Mozambique Channel in the Indian Ocean. Recently, we've seen several insurrections in northern Mozambique that have led to disruption in the Mozambique Channel, which is also an important maritime route, and where Europeans are also interested. France are also actually some territories in the region. And another region to look at is the South Pacific, or the Pacific Islands region. We know that China has stepped up its presence and influence there. There was a security deal signed with the Solomon Islands. And some people are talking about a reinforced Chinese presence or military presence in the region. We are not here yet, but anyway, that might be a concern in the future. Another kind of threat is the challenge to the rule of law, and here I'm thinking especially about the practice of lawfare by China, who is well known how Beijing misused the international law of the sea to in both the East and South China Sea to assert its administrative control over several features and areas claimed by other states in the region, and is trying to restrain the freedom of navigation in those areas that is considered being under its sovereignty. And we know that China also dismissed the award by the arbitration court back in 2016 that ruled against China and recognized that China's claim on some territories falling into the control of the Philippines are actually not relevant and are not consistent with the international law. We know that the Chinese authorities are closely monitoring the ships that go both in the South China Sea and also in the Taiwan Straits, and they are getting more and more nervous in the region. And we know that because there's several cases of ships going through the Straits that have been kind of closely monitored, closely controlled by the Chinese authorities, and we know that China would like to, at some point, to transform and to make this international international water into kind of the domestic water. So this is obviously a very huge threat to the freedom of navigation. And it has implication beyond Asia, obviously, because of the very nature of the law of the sea. And here I would like to quote a former Minister of Defense of France, Jean-Yves Le Drian, back in 2016, and he said at the Shangri-La Dialogue, if the law of the sea is not respected today in the China seas, it will be threatened tomorrow in the Arctic, the Mediterranean, or elsewhere. So this is really demonstrating why the European has a keen and legitimate interest to also tackle this issue in the Indo-Pacific. The third kind of threat is the non-traditional security issue, so to say. We see more and more also cases of criminal activities at sea due to marine environmental destruction, fish scarcity, and also some impact of the climate change in the region. We see also a progress in technology that has accelerated in a way the race for the exploitation of the deep deep seabed mineral resources that are also very much needed for the production of batteries. And this is also pointing, yeah, I'm I'm late already. Okay, I will be quick. Pointing to the importance of the maritime infrastructure, such as such as undersea cables. So what we can do about it? We can uphold the rules-based maritime order in accordance with international law, and this Professor Iida really talked about it. We can do it in a diplomatic way. We can diplomatically support UNCLOS. There have been a number of not verbal that were handled to the UN, including by European powers to protest the situation in the South China Sea. We can do it by sending ships in the region to exercise the freedom of navigation. Also, again, Europeans are doing that, and there are more and more, you know, to do it, to send their ships. France, of course, but also Germany. And others. So it's very important symbolic signaling. It's not all, but it's important. What we can do also, it's to help our like-minded partners in the region to build up their capacities to better monitor their waters, and to be able to counter some antagonistic moves. And so here I won't I can talk about it later on, but Europeans have obviously long experience in the region, especially in the Western Indian Ocean with the Atalanta operation to tackle piracy in the region, and the Crimario program that helps building up the maritime domain awareness of countries in the region, setting up some information fusion centers, and so on. And this program is being expanded all the way to Southeast Asia and the Pacific. And so the next step, just in one word, would be to coordinate more what we do, obviously, in the region between the European, the Japanese, the Americans. There are several initiatives that have been taken recently, unilateral, more or less a big group of states, and we need to work more together to avoid overlapping and be more efficient. And that's all for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Celine, for a very enlightening assessment of the various issues and challenges at play. Before we're going to go to Paul, I wanted to also pose you a question. If I listen to French admirals, they are never tired to remind me that France is indeed a global maritime power that has territories in all major oceans. And France is, of course, a key continental European power. You outline a number of ways in which Europeans and France can contribute to upholding key aspects of the maritime security order. In your assessment, does France have the capabilities, and we're going to pivot to Paul later on, but have the capabilities and the wherewithal to support these political solutions that you sketch?
Political solutions, I'm not sure that what you're talking about, but yes, France has to have territories in the region. We have some military forces based there. So yeah, obviously we have the capacity to uphold and to help support the international rules-based order in the region. And as you know, the French position is not completely aligned with that of the US. So we don't say that we are going to the Indo-Pacific to against any country, but we are upholding universal principles. So that's we are very comfortable with this kind of thing. But of course, we all have to cooperate together. I mean, we all have to work together for this. Professor Iida reminded of the very huge, vast sea lanes of communication. We have to think about which ways we could be the more efficient, maybe by focusing on some areas. France has a good asset in the Western Indian Ocean and also in the South Pacific. So that might be two regions where we could have a added value to push a little bit more and to lead some initiative to ensure that the freedom of navigation and law of the sea is actually respected. So that's not a very satisfactory answer, but I would say yes, of course, but no country has on its own the capacity to uphold freedom of navigation. So it's necessary to cooperate.
Excellent. Thank you, Celine. And that was precisely what I was getting at. And you already pointed out, for instance, the issue of regional specialization in terms of divisions of labor. And you've also touched on the issue of aligning yourself fully with the US in the emerging Sino-American competition. No, this is about a broader notion of international order that the French support. So thank you very much for that. I think that also forms a very nice bridge into Paul van Hooft, his contribution. Paul, please, the floor is yours for at least 10 minutes, but not many more minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. As Tim already said, we've been thinking about what role Europe should play in the Indo-Pacific for the last 2 years. So I'm excited to have another opportunity this afternoon to present some of our ideas, some of our questions, and some of our solutions. Before I start with that, I just wanted to thank Benedetta, Joris, Patrick for doing all the organization, making sure that this is all running smoothly, and we can just focus on making a few hopefully smart points. So I'll do it in three steps. First, I'll sketch the overall what we think are key aspects of the overall context. I won't have to go long on that because I think the two previous speakers already did an excellent job of that. Then the second one will be to think a bit more about what kind of choices, what kind of major questions Europeans as a whole and individually should tackle with. And the third one would be to focus somewhat on a set of potential solutions, a set of policies to maybe really put some more emphasis on. So first, to sketch the context, as previously noted, as Celine just, I think, did an excellent job of telling us, it is hard to imagine Europe not being involved in the Indo-Pacific to an ever greater extent over the coming years and decades. It is a region of growing geoeconomic importance, growing political importance, growing cultural importance. In every way, it's what has become apparent in the last few years is that the center of global activity of all kinds, the center of gravity is really in the Indo-Pacific. In a very narrow sense, that is clearly the amount of trade, the extent to which European prosperity depends on unimpeded, consistent exchanges with Asian economies is absolutely apparent. All of that trade, as Celine also said, essentially takes place over water through a few very select seas and choke points. So from something that's very easy to grasp, I think, for any interested citizen, we also get in very quickly into the nitty-gritty of maritime security and naval capabilities. And that is exactly where I think that, we also have to acknowledge the extreme limits under which European states of any kind, even and I'm including the UK in Europe here, whether they like it or not, but even the two major maritime powers, France and the UK, have very limited naval capacity to project to the other side of the world. In a report we published last year, we did a back of the envelope sketch of how many ships each of the major European maritime powers had, and major in this sense also included the Netherlands, Germany, the Netherlands, Italy, Spain, and even for UK and France, for when it comes to destroyers or frigates, at any moment there will be about 5 available. Once you start taking into account how many have to be are being repaired, maintained, crews are resting, recovering, all these are hard constraints that it's very difficult, as Celine also alluded to, with the amount of ships being built. It's very hard to imagine that can substantially change, even with the greatest willpower, in the next 5 or 10 years. And when it comes to that willpower, there's the question of how much will be possible to split those resources between the very clear demands in Europe right now versus those on the other side of the world. So there's two poles here which are pulling in different, or at least in great tension with each other. Absolutely clear that it's a critically important region, maybe the critically important region after taking care of European imminent security needs, but also one in which, at present, because of the developments of the last 3, maybe even 8 decades, Europeans will have very little, at least in a military sense, to contribute. Yet, even the Netherlands sent a ship in 2021, is planning to send another to make another visit in 2024. Our defense minister at the Shangri-La summit committed us to doing this every 2 years. So, it clearly shows how much we are interested and the importance we attach to it, but also the limits in which we can do so. And that gets us to the next point, is really the choices. How do we think this through strategically? And then there's a number of things that are all in some ways desirable, but somewhat at odds with each other. So in our current work, what we've done, we've basically summarized and crystallized them into 3 major options, which is that Europeans can either, when we're talking about maritime security, they can either think of this as doing the most in a more minimal version, which can still be quite extensive in terms of resources, but minimally just to ensure that they maintain access to the key Asian economies, which means you still have some naval capacity, but you try to stay out of all the trickier parts, all the intensifying Sino-American competition. You try to avoid engaging too directly with China when it comes to its vastly superior capabilities, and you essentially try to do the most minimal thing for your own interest, with all the repercussions that has. Both in terms of reputation and in terms of order, which is the second point. Either, if you do not do the first, you could think of focusing your efforts on what you can do to uphold the multilateral, rule-based, legal, whatever we want to call it, the international order, the maritime order. And that is an objective that, of course, is also supported by the US, but is also a real and substantial interest of small and middle powers in Europe and Asia. It is one that, regardless of what regime they have, regardless of how compatible they are in terms of democratic values, what they do all agree upon, and however they feel about how to position themselves vis-a-vis China and the US, what they do all agree upon is that they would like these maritime lines of communication to work for everyone, to not be interfered with any great power, and basically for the rules to work, because the rules are constraining for everyone, but to a sense they are more constrained for great powers. And that, I think, or that's what we think is something that Europe can really make a contribution to. But that would be somewhat in tension with the third potential objectives from the European perspective, which is to be there simply to support US hegemony, to basically be in the Indo-Pacific to signal that the transatlantic relationship is strong, that the US should continue to protect Europe. Now, while that wouldn't be a new kind of way of thinking about using European militaries, I think it's the way that, to a large extent, Europeans became involved in the greater Middle Eastern conflicts, the war on terror in Afghanistan. That might, in the context of the Indo-Pacific, not be the most effective way to do it. Because if we look at the different major actors in the region, a more, let's say, confrontational approach, or an approach that more directly supports the US, has very few regional supporters. I think to some extent that such an approach would be supported by Japan, to a lesser extent, I think also by Australia, but after that, and Taiwan. But after that, there would be many states, I think that already includes South Korea, that would have great hesitation to take such a kind of overly militarized, overly confrontational approach with China. And I think that specifically that trepidation would be concentrated in Southeast Asia and South Asia. And I think that makes it very difficult to achieve these other objectives, which would be to essentially ensure that the order as it is for all powers, whatever their, however much we agree with them or not, that order, that the legal means to settle disputes, that kind of aspect is protected and safeguarded. So that also means that when Europeans think about their presence in the Indo-Pacific, they should first clarify which of these objectives they're trying to achieve and who they need for that, and which signals to send to those regional partners. So and that's the third and final part, what we would argue is just a sketch of a series of ideas we've been working on. One would be to think in a very clear way about differentiation at a sub-regional level in policies, to have a very different kind of engagement with kind of the more straightforward partners and allies of NATO, which include Japan, South Korea, to have a different engagement than with the states that are somewhat more ambivalent, or no, ambivalent is too soft a word, are very hesitant and would like to avoid choosing between the US and China at all costs, to make a more regional differentiated approach, because in many of the states in Southeast Asia, in our interactions with them, the emphasis is not at all on a blue water, military power projection, showing off the flag kind of presence. The interest is really in capacity building and maybe on things that are, ostensibly less spectacular than an aircraft carrier, but on maritime law enforcement, on other measures of statecraft, economic support, development, capacity building, rather than the bigger kind of show of force, which would get to the second point, which would be more explicitly that maritime presence, the maritime security efforts needed, and that's also been said by the previous speakers, need to be combined with other tools of statecraft, like economic development, trade deals. I think it's from the Dutch perspective, from some of the conversations we've had internally with the ministries, we also recognize that there have been, in previous visits, there have been missed opportunities to have a whole package of other diplomatic initiatives that will run long after a port visit has come and gone. That has to be also in there, so sustain longer, more substantial efforts. From the European side, that also means that when in the region, it is a real question on which flag to show the flag, which flag is the best to show, and perhaps that and which partners to operate with, and that if again, depending on what the purpose is, if the purpose is to uphold a multilateral maritime order, then perhaps national flags or an EU flag on a certain context might be a much more powerful signal that small and middle powers are all, even from the other side of the world, are all showing their support for an order, rather than operating, let alone a NATO flag, which so far nobody has spoken seriously about, but also operating next to the United States, right? Not so much for the relationship with China, but for the relationship with pretty much every other regional state, with the exception of a few, with whom we have excellent relations already, so which are not really going to fall in the group that has to be convinced one way or the other. And then for the European part, finally, we must think of other ways to pool our resources. That we've written some recommendations in previous research where we looked at how to better utilize the infrastructure that various European states, specifically France and the UK, have in the region, how to pre-position more supplies, pre-position things even like munitions, as we can see from the current war, to have any credibility in terms of any kind of deterrent or reassuring effect, you do need to have things readily available. And to do things like the permanent maritime presence, to have coordination mechanisms that ensure there's a constant rotation in and out in the various sub-regions of European ships, although those do not always need to be necessarily the most spectacular blue water, show of force kind of capabilities. And I think those things together, coordinating the different means of the different policy tools, coordinating that presence more and more, trying to send clear and consistent political signals. I think that actually European states are positioned to at least make a contribution to a serious contribution to upholding the multilateral order in the wider Indo-Pacific, and thereby maybe have a contribution to make to dampening the risks of escalation between the US and China. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Super, Paul. Thank you very much. Indeed. I also have a question for you. It's perhaps a tad technical, but you have picked up on some of the themes that Masafumi and Celine have spoken about. The need for engagement, regional specialization, talking about leveraging existing capabilities that are limited. But you've also highlighted the fact that Europeans do not necessarily want to be sucked into the Sino-American competition, and that we can perhaps indeed make a distinction between upholding the maritime order rather than contributing to escalation. And you've then highlighted a permanent rotating presence, and here's the technical question, are there also particular capabilities that your particular types of naval vessels that Europeans can employ going to the region to show that signal and thereby engage also with partnerships? And that is the notion of partnerships is something that we're going to pose to all speakers afterwards. Paul.
Thanks, Tim. This gets very. I think these are exactly the kind of questions we need to ask and have an answer for. Again, if we think about it in regionally differentiated manners, I think for a lot great parts of South Asia, Southeast Asia, showing up with not showing up with destroyers and aircraft carriers, but showing off with offshore patrol boats that can do trainings, exercises on law enforcement practices, to combine this with onshore training, or to combine this with the maritime legal expertise we have. That, I think, sends a stronger signal about a consistent engagement that is not confrontational. Okay? Now, that could be mixed with sending different capabilities to, let's say, Japan, right? Where the sign of support for more security, for more defensive purposes, would be understood in different ways. So that would be an example of differentiated and zooming in on very specific capabilities, and some of which are not as demanding, right? The offshore patrol boats are not as demanding. They are less ostentatious, but that's in sense might be precisely the point we want to achieve. There's there's I think a great risk from conversations I've had in the past year. There's a great risk with representatives from Bangladesh or Pakistan or Malaysia, Indonesia. There's a great risk that some of those efforts could otherwise be understood in the light of our colonial legacy, and that is something we cannot undo, but that is also something we can't shy away from. This is a very tricky, I think, needle to thread, one of the many needles to thread here, but by differentiating those approaches, I think that we can make that signal more powerfully.
Excellent. Thank you, Paul. I see the questions are coming in through the Q&A. So audience, please submit any questions you have and we'll post them to our distinguished panelists. A question that I wanted to pose is our panelists have described an array of threats, if you like, both traditional security threats and the deteriorating security situation and the actual the fears that some of these nations have vis-a-vis a rising China. We've discussed non-traditional threats, including coastal security, and we've also touched upon a merger of that, and some of the someone in the audience already remarked upon the role of maritime militias that are state-sponsored. And then there are, of course, broader issues related to environmental security and the implications of security change. Climate change, excuse me. So the question here, and Mr. Masafumi Iida, I first wanted to pose this question to you, is if you look at this array of different issues, it really is a patchwork of different issues, and you look at the role of middle powers, both in the region and middle powers from Europe, what types of coalitions, what types of partnerships can you, from a Japanese perspective, emphasize? I mean, in particular areas, you see that the US prefers to operate in a minilateral framework. In others, perhaps a multilateral framework is better. So what types of partnerships and coalitions can you emphasize? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your question. And it's a very important and a good question. And I think that probably it depends on the issues which we have to deal with. For example, if we would like to deal with the Chinese military power, which is used to change the status quo, we have to deal with these issues in military ways. In this case, we need to enhance our cooperation with the countries which has enough military power, of course, led by the United States and also the Australia and other some of the regional countries. But if we would like to deal with the other type of the issues like the anti-piracy, maybe we can invite much more countries which would like to maintain the stability or the counter the piracies actions in the waters, not only in the South China Sea, Malacca Strait, but also the Gulf of Aden. And so probably in this case, we can even invite the Chinese PLA. So now we see that the PLA is participating in the anti-piracy international operations in the Gulf of Aden. So I think even though in my presentation, I put the emphasis on the China challenges against the status quo in the maritime order, but also actually the China and the other countries shares some important common interest in the maritime order or maritime domain. And so I think that the framework of bilateral, unilateral, or the multilateral cooperation is dependent on which type of issues we would like to deal with.
Excuse me. Thank you. Celine, you've really sketched us a very nice taxonomy of types of threats. would you have some thoughts on types of partnerships that are more amenable to meet certain challenges, what partnerships are better suited to meet other challenges?
Yes, it's not so easy. We see a flurry of initiative, certainly minilaterals and so on. What we need certainly is to keep flexibility in the way we engage with partners in the region. Obviously, the strategic situation is very fluid, so it will be difficult to commit in a very solid way, so to say. So we need this flexibility, and I think I would maybe join Iida Sensei when you say that it depends on what you want to achieve, really, because you can think about some coalitions for broader aims and some other more limited group, solution-driven limited groups that is going to focus on a specific issue and be much more efficient. The thing is that the great power competition is unfortunately contaminating everything, all the issues, even when it comes to common goods, such as freedom of navigation and so on. So it makes things difficult, I think, also for the Europeans and for the French, as I see it, when it's UN-led initiative, it can be seen as being too confrontational vis-à-vis China, even if the ultimate objective is also to provide common goods. So that's a dilemma. That's something we have to address. And there is the question, also for the Quad. The Quad is really that. I mean, you have this US initiative. It's not only the US, Japan has its own point of view, Australia too, India certainly is not maybe on the same line as the other, and does not want to make it a kind of alliance. And the Quad evolved in the recent years to be seen more as a kind of provider of common good for the region, with initiative on vaccine and also on maritime domain awareness also recently. So we have to think about the the feasibility to associate at some point, maybe with initiative like this, to think about some ad hoc cooperation on specific issues that we share, the interest, the principle on, and on which the European also has an added value. I mean, for the MDA initiative, it's quite obvious because we already have this experience. And we also want to go in the region and to expand in the region. So I think it would make perfect sense to talk together and to cooperate on this.
Excellent, thank you, Paul. There's a question for you from the audience. An anonymous attendee asked, Paul, you mentioned the necessity to avoid Southeast Asian states' alienation. So what would be a way to enhance European presence in the Indo-Pacific without alienating the Southeast Asian states? Paul.
Well, thank you. So I think that's a good question. I answered, I think partly in my previous answer, I tried to touch on some of this. You want to think of having a maritime presence, but of a different kind, a naval presence of a different kind, different as concretely as different ship class and so on. And you want to engage in doing more capacity building. That is, can be done on a bilateral basis, sometimes unilateral, but that might be something where the EU is really well designed to do this, to do capacity, to focus on developing institutions, on governance, on how to set up frameworks for legal frameworks. These are things that organization is well suited for, and that underline that message that we care, but this is also possible to care in a different way than simply participating in a confrontation between two superpowers. And you could think of, for instance, you can also think of, when I mentioned the bilateral, you could think of simple things like a state like Bangladesh has many of the same problems that a country like the Netherlands has, which is it's a river delta that's prone to flooding. We have certain expertise built up over centuries. That is something you can do to share, to invest in, and therefore show, look, it is more than, it is more than simply trying to just have Europe. It's not European neocolonialism. It is a different view of order. It's not a one about prestige, as perhaps the US might be seen to be pursuing. It's not one about ensuring that resources are in European hands, as the Chinese attempts might be seen as. It is something of a different kind. And that takes a long and persistent effort. Other things that fit into that, which are not necessarily, might not seem as spectacular as some of the big moves we're talking about, is to have a more prominent diplomatic presence there, meaning you send more high-level dignitaries more often. I think this is a problem that I've also heard about from counterparts in other regions, like Sub-Saharan Africa as well. We don't show up enough anymore to and give people the respect they feel they deserve. And I think that's it's a very simple but basic fact of diplomacy, and that should be followed up with all these the capacity, all these other measures. So that's a very basic point of it. And I'll leave it there.
Excellent. Thank you, Paul. Masafumi, a question from Giovanni Cisco he asks, what do you think about the trend seeing European states significantly increasing their defense spending? How do you think this relates to the Indo-Pacific, and how is that seen from East Asian states such as Japan? And if I may add, here in the European context, we're of course having to deal with the largest war on the European continent since the Second World War, which really is a geopolitical major shock, which has caused what the Germans call a Zeitenwende. And still, we see a whole debate in Germany, given Germany's war legacy, about how to help Ukraine in a way that is consistent with their values. Now, we of course also know that Japan has a constitution, and for a very long time has emphasized self-defense and did not significantly increase its defense spending, but that has been changing in recent years and in recent days. So could you talk us, European audience here, also talk through is there a Zeitenwende in Japan as well? And what is happening there, and what is the scale of the increases in defense spending? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your question. Yeah, first of all, I think not only Japan, but also many of the East Asian countries really understands the need for the European countries to expand their defense budget to counter the Russian intention and actions to change the territorial borders by military force. It is the very, very clear infringement by the Russian forces to the existing international law, international order, and rule of the rules-based international order. So that's why I think many of the regional countries really understand and actually support the European efforts to support the Ukrainian resistance against the Russian invasion, which is contrary to the existing rules-based order. And at the same time, at least Japan and some of the regional countries understands the same. If we we allow the Russia to achieve to make some achievement in their invasion of Ukraine, probably we can see we want to see the same situation in this region by China. You know that the problem is the problem we are facing with the Chinese actions to change the rules-based international existing order by their growing military force, and of course, and the including and also the growing their economic influence and the political diplomatic influence in this region. So I think that this is why the Japanese government shows very clear stance to support the European efforts, the US efforts to counter the Russian invasion in Ukraine, and also in such case, in such circumstances, I think that more and more Japanese people are changing their sense of security around Japan. I mean that as you pointed out, after the World War II, for a long time, the Japanese people are really reluctant to just talking about security issues. And also because of that, and also the Japanese constitution, the self-defense forces didn't have the credible counterattack capabilities for more than 70 years. But you know that facing with the real existential threats, problems caused by the China and later the Russia, I think the Japanese people is changing their minds to understand the need for Japanese self-defense forces have some offensive capabilities to some extent to defending our national security and also the maintaining the stability of this region. So I think that this is the how to say. I think this is going to be a kind of common sense among the Japanese people about we have to make more efforts and more contributions, proactive contributions to maintain the stability in this region by including the spending more budget for defense. This is my opinion.
Excellent. Thank you, Masafumi. Then there is a question from the audience for you, Celine. It's from Santiago José de Castillo. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Despite the PLA Navy being the main maritime element of China's influence in the Indo-Pacific, lately we've heard news of the so-called Spratly Backbone Fleet, part of the China militia fleet. I think we already partly alluded to it. What threats can these militia fleets pose to Japan and other countries in Southeast Asia? And how is that seen from a maritime security perspective? And specifically, Santiago asked, Mrs. Pajon has remarked on the reinterpretation of the naval rules by many nations. Could this case fall into this category? And more importantly, how can this be prevented, mitigated, or countered indeed? Celine.
Thank you. Yes, indeed, I think it would fall into the hybrid kind of warfare we see used by China in the region, so including lawfare, but also using in a way some non-military actor to actually back the national interest of China in the region, and China is doing that also through its Coast Guard. Actually, in 2021, China adopted a law that authorized their Coast Guard to use force against other ships that they could encounter in the region. And actually, according to law, Coast Guard are law enforcement forces, so they are very tight constrained. They are not military forces just to, to use disproportionate force to actually push their interest. So that was a big concern, I think, for Japan and for other countries in the region, because that means that unilaterally China can escalate the situation very, very quickly. And this through, a non-military player. So China is trying always to push the neighbors to be the first to use the military force to reverse the proof, saying that, well, you were the one who started the conflict because you were the one who used your military against my poor Coast Guard or my militia or my fishermen, the fishermen just over here to fish, but we know that they are disguised into fishermen, and they have guns, they have weapons, and the militia are also now a well recognized part of the Chinese arsenal, so to say, to advance their interest in unilateral way, asymmetric way in the region. So you have the naval forces, the Coast Guard, and the militia, of course. So that's akin to the green man that Russia also sent in recent years, and we know that it's very difficult to tackle this kind of move, because it's obviously out of the traditional framework and traditional scenarios that we know. So how to tackle that? We have to, I think, deter, by just talking about it, saying that we know the true nature of this kind of actor, and we know that what you're doing with this kind of player. So diplomatically, I think it is very important to have this a big group of countries actually condemning such a kind of practices. Then we have to deter by also reinforcing the maritime surveillance in the region, and also as we said, we discussed previously, reinforcing the capacity of the countries in the region to better monitor and to better be able to assess what's going on, and finally maybe to be able to react in a proper way. So with also maritime capacity such as patrol boat and so on, because a lot of countries in the region might not have the proper also capabilities to act in this way. So so that's all the tricks. We have to deter them, and we have to prevent all these practices. And when there is some reaction, we have to be extra careful not to escalate, not to be the one to escalate the situation, which is very difficult.
Excellent, Celine, and thank you for that expansive answer, talking about deterrence at various levels. And deterrence is something I would also like to have Paul van Hooft comment upon. But let's take this as a twofold question, Paul. First, there's a question from the audience, from Alex, who asked, given China's development of anti-ship missiles designed to destroy or disable large naval vessels, is it likely we will see Navy shifting to small naval vessels fielded in larger numbers? Now, while answering that question, Paul, could you also take it a bit more expansively and talk about denial capabilities? You and I have done work on deterrence by denial capabilities, and how small and middle powers can in fact wield these sorts of capabilities to perhaps deter adversaries from attacking. Could you talk both about the strength of it, but also about the limitations, and reflect on how that may have a role in upholding regional security, building, of course, on what Celine already said? Thank you, Paul.
Yes. Thank you, Tim. When I saw the question, my mind already went towards the denial towards the denial aspect. So what I think is important about the question of China's development of anti-ship missiles, whether that's what the effect has on the military operational aspects of navies operating in the Western Pacific, is that this is not just a technical question for for members of the military to solve, but actually it points to quite a few things about larger principles of deterrence, and therefore also for what is exactly needed to prevent China from dominating the region. So we've seen an ongoing trend. I mean, it's not even a trend then anymore. Over the last 50 years, missiles have become more and more accurate. The oceans are more and more transparent. And it also makes sense that for ships, for surface ships, this is particularly problematic. Right? There's on land, there are places to hide. At the seas, there are no places to hide. Everything that is within the range of a radar is essentially seen. And there are some technological solutions that are being attempted, but this essentially holds. So that transparency, that precision was for a long time primarily available to the United States and a few of its allies, but now it's become kind of widespread. China's really invested in this specifically to prevent the US from projecting power into its vicinity. Why is that important? Because if the US cannot project power into the vicinity of China, it is very hard to come to the assistance of allies like Japan, but it would be particularly difficult and risky to intervene in a conflict over Taiwan. So this is not just a technical question, but one that really says for how a lot of the overall political order in the Western Pacific, the overall shape it can actually take. So yes, just to answer first the question, I do think that there's a size and vulnerability trade-off. I think there's a lot to be said for larger numbers of destroyers, completely packed with missiles, and a move to use, if we think about things like aircraft carriers, which only applies for the US, to move those further and further away and to treat them in a different way, to treat them as floating Hawaiis, to basically have air power coming from much further away before it gets within range of Chinese capabilities. This would be very drastically different than the way that they were thought to have been used in the 90s and in the early 2000s. But also more and more ships, and one can think of using unmanned ships for many of these, right? So ships that at least don't carry that cost of using a highly trained crew of sailors. But what I think was going to be particularly important, then we get into the certain kind of denial. Certain kind of denial options in the Western Pacific, which is to focus on land-based missiles. I wrote a little bit on those overall dynamics in War on the Rocks 2 years ago. But as we can already see in Japan, in South Korea, in Taiwan to some degree, but also now in the Philippines, there's more and more investments in land-based missiles that can do a lot to prevent, not ensure that the US commands the Western Pacific, but to prevent China from making use of those common spaces on the waters, in the air, and that by itself, that's denial. So so China cannot fully use them, and therefore it is always going to be limited in terms of how much military power it can project, and therefore limited into what kind of effect it can have on shaping the order in the Western Pacific. So yes, this is a whole set of from the very military operational practices all the way into what China can or cannot do, rather, to dominate the region. Now, none of this stuff is so easy, and there's a lot of risk in which advanced conventional weapons can, because of their often dual-use functions, because of the way that China has commingled a lot of its advanced conventional weapons with its nuclear forces, that there's a lot of risks of inadvertent escalation. But that said, probably those risks for land-based missiles by smaller and middle powers in the region are probably less than for the US.
Thank you, Paul. And for people interested in this particular topic, we have a Deterrence and Arms Control series in which we have contributions by scholars around the globe. And the day before yesterday, or it was yesterday, we published a piece by a Philippine expert talking about what that conventional denial, the terms by denial, would look like in the maritime context in the Philippines, who also touches upon the issues that you raised, Celine, in the sort of deterring maritime militias and how to go about that. We're nearing 4 o'clock. So what I would like to do is I want to ask our panelists, or give you the chance, to share a final thought with our audiences. We kicked off talking about the increasing, intensifying great power competition, which is putting pressure on the security of sea lines of communication, which are of key importance both to middle powers in the Indo-Pacific and here in Europe. We've highlighted how these middle powers can indeed play a vital role in the political, in the economic, but also in the military realm. And I think we've highlighted a number of very relevant bits and pieces there, spoken about the need for partnerships in a flexible way, and highlighted a number of pathways as to how that could be achieved. With that, it's 2023. The way forward is hopefully a peaceful path forward. So Masafumi, can I ask you to first share your concluding thought with the audience, then go to Celine, and then to you, Paul, and then we'll wrap up the session.
Yeah, first of all, thank you again for giving me this opportunity to understand the European perception of China affairs in this region. Yeah, it is understandable for me that the European countries has a slightly different security threat perceptions on China. It is very understandable, and I can understand the different relations between the difference in the relations between the European countries with China, and also the Japan's relation with China. But what I would like to emphasize lastly here is that what the East Asian countries facing, the problem East Asian countries is facing is very similar to the problem the European countries is facing. That is the increasing of the emergence of the revisionist power. And it is very clear that now the two major revisionist power, China and Russia, is uniting, is enhancing their coordination to challenge the existing international order. So that's why I think of course, in a different way, but the Japan and the European countries and other status quo powers shares the common interest to maintain the existing international order, especially in the maritime domain. Thank you.
Thank you. That's very enlightening, Masafumi. Let's go over to you, Celine.
I have no better than Iida, so Iida-san. So yeah, I would say that yeah, certainly the war in Ukraine is focusing our attention in Europe, but also what happened in recent years with the COVID and a lot of international turmoil showed that the world is really interconnected, and the sea is interconnecting all our countries together. We see, as you said, the rise of the revisionist power. We see China and Russia working together more closely every day. So this just highlight the fact that we have the legitimacy, and we have the also the all reasons to look at what happened in the Indo-Pacific, and to act also and contribute to the safety of the maritime routes in the Indo-Pacific, and work with our partners in the region.
Thank you, Celine. Paul, then you.
Thank you. Yeah, so I guess to wrap that up, yes, I think the final thoughts, we should really look at these dual threats of the revisionist powers, both in Europe and Asia. I think it also shows the last year, beyond all the miseries of the war, there is some light at the end of the tunnel, seeing how quickly in the few days after the invasion, European states, on the leadership of the US, but European states together with Japan, South Korea, and others came together to ensure that clear exports, the control sanctions on Russian imports were put in place. And that's, I think, is a very good signal, but also a very effective use of our relative advantages and our relative capabilities. So I think that's a very hopeful sign. I also think that it also shows that we can do a lot more than we've previously assumed, and that given the uncertainties, both of those threats we're facing, and of the uncertainty about the US capability to continue to be a security provider everywhere, it also underlines that we should and we can and we hopefully will take each of these middle powers in Europe and Asia will take greater responsibility for their own security and for upholding the system as it is, which is still better than all the alternatives we've had so far. I'll leave it there.
I couldn't agree more with that, Paul. So, dear panelists, thank you very much. We would also be amiss if we wouldn't thank the Japanese embassy here in The Hague for their financial support in making this webinar possible. It doesn't cease to amaze me how this globalized world allows us to seamlessly tune in, but it also shows how important it is, because we can indeed exchange ideas about making this world a more peaceful place in the years to come, with contributions from Japan, from France, and from The Hague. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for attending. We hope to see you next time at another seminar organized by HCSS. Wishing you a very good afternoon and a great weekend. Bye-bye.